Peruvian President Pedro Castillo is currently experiencing another crisis, given the fact that the country's main ombudsman, Walter Gutierrez, publicly asked him to resign along with newspaper del Comercio. Both Gutierrez and this newspaper asked Pedro Castillo to resign. In an interview with CNN's Fernando del Rincón and on social media, on Twitter, more specifically on Twitter, Gutierrez claimed that the left-wing president Pedro Castillo needed to resign because of his inefficiency and what he described as his lack of respect for Peru's democratic values. Meanwhile, the newspaper El Comercio claimed in an editorial that Pedro Castillo basically needed to take this step because of the political crisis and Castillo's lack of efficiency to solve it properly. Of course, this opinion, this position is quite ironic, because we need to take into consideration the fact that Peru has always been a country that has been experiencing a lot of political crisis over the last few decades, to the point where there has been a lot of presidents in a pretty short period of time over the last few years. So the fact that El Comercio basically publishes this editorial is quite ironic, because we need to remember that this wasn't exactly the position that this newspaper had with previous presidents, including Pedro Kuczynski, who of course needed to resign basically. So what is quite interesting is the fact that right after these declarations, both from Gutierrez and from the El Comercio newspaper, Peru's newly elected Prime Minister Aníbal Torres said during a press conference that the government of President Pedro Castillo will now pursue free market policies. The reason why this is quite interesting is because we need to remember that Pedro Castillo is essentially a communist. I'm not exaggerating, because we all know that there are different types of left-wing politics, of left-wing ideologies. We're talking about socialism, we're talking about social democracy, communism, and Pedro Castillo is essentially this last one. Pedro Castillo has always been a Marxist-Leninist, and many people actually thought that once he got into power, Peru was going to inevitably follow the path of other countries in Latin America, such as Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, who have followed extreme left-wing path, which eventually evolved into a horrible tyranny, and a tyranny, of course, a dictatorship with a widespread crisis. So many people thought that this was going to be the exact scenario of Peru, but we are now watching the Prime Minister Aníbal Torres pointing out that the government will pursue free market policies. Of course, it is an undeniable fact that this could be nothing more than a strategy to appease the private sector in the country, given the fact that there are powerful factions in Peru that are already calling for Pedro Castillo to resign. So we need to remember that this whole debacle started right after the interview that Pedro Castillo provided to CNN's Fernando del Rincón, an interview which we already talked in a previous episode here on Newsweek, an episode where Pedro Castillo basically hinted that he recognizes Nicolás Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela, and that he essentially refused to condemn the dictatorships of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. This was quite controversial in Latin America. However, in Peru, specifically in Peru, what was extremely controversial about this interview was the fact that on one point, Pedro Castillo told Fernando del Rincón that he was essentially not prepared for this position as president. So the Peruvian opposition took advantage of these declarations to start to create this narrative that essentially suggests that Pedro Castillo is someone who is not prepared to rule Peru, and that he essentially recognized it. So we're going to see what is going to happen, because this is a situation that is definitely going to evolve, and it's not, I mean, the possibility that Pedro Castillo eventually resigns is not out of the table. After all, we're talking about Peru. Reporting from Medellin, Colombia, Luis Orozco, Newsweek.